Good morning, my art history students, or good evening, or good afternoon, whenever you're watching this video. Today we're going to be learning about the art of the classical world, the Minoans, the Mycenaeans, and the early Greeks. And it's really a cool new phase that we're in after we've left Egypt, because we're going to be really seeing and speaking about things that are still with us today in the modern world. Specifically, this idea of democracy. Also, we're going to be using this word classic, right? Classic. And I want you guys to think about what that means to you in your life. When you hear the word classic, what does it mean, right? Oh, that's a classic car. That's a classic rock song. That's a classic Italian meal. And what does the using the word classic mean in that context? So this is something we're going to be speaking about. I just wanted to say a little bit about Canvas and about the assignments and Pearson and everything. And I just want to tell you guys that, again, I'm doing my best. I've done my best over the summer to convert all my courses into virtual asynchronous classes. And I know that in doing that on Canvas, I've done a lot of things wrong. I've made mistakes. That doesn't mean they can't be rectified. So I appreciate all of your emails, your questions, and I do read them all, and I'm trying to get back to them as soon as possible. But know that I have the ultimate ability to override anything in terms of grades on Canvas. Okay? So with that, let's get started. So we talk about sort of this new system that we're in, this new world we're in, where now there's going to be a shift, and it's going to be a focus on man instead of the focus on the king or, the government or the state. It's really a focus on man, or at least a few men. And we're going to have this thing called democracy. And I think that that's one of the reasons that when you look at government buildings in our country and in many countries around the world, not just the United States, a lot of the government buildings look like Greek temples, right? Think about the White House. Think about even our US Supreme Court. We'll talk about that. So democracy represents a new political system that replaces the God-king rule, right? That the God and the king are all wrapped up into one man. And we saw that in the ancient Near East and certainly in Egypt among the pharaohs. And there's going to be a new artistic intent, right? We talk all the way through our course that all art has intention. It has an idea behind it. And in fact, in Greek art, the new art's intent is to reflect these new human values of truth, harmony, and virtue. So that's a cool thing to think about. How's that going to happen? And we are now in what is called the Bronze Age. Okay. A couple of, I guess it was last year when I was teaching this course, all of a sudden the Sunday New York Times Magazine had this on the cover. And it is kind of a sculpture of a very, very famous Greek sculpture we're going to look at probably next class called the Cretios Boy. And they put Brad Pitt's head on it. So I thought it was kind of crazy, and I want you guys to remember this when we look at the sculpture. And it's an interesting question to ask ourselves, does life imitate art? Does art imitate life? And I think the more you learn about art, you'll start to see these connections in society. And here it is. Here's the sculpture that I was talking about, where you can see, you can see the sculpture that they took of the very famous, actually, I'm sorry, it's not the Cretios Boy, it's Michelangelo's David that we'll learn about during the Renaissance. And they put Brad Pitt with a bit of a fig leaf, put Brad Pitt's head. So one of the things that we are going to be talking about now, moving forward, is this question, what is beauty, right? What is beautiful? And who decides that? And how does that change depending on which culture we're in, what time period we're in? So I think it's something, really quite interesting to think about. So with all of that, with our discussion about what is beauty, does life imitate art? What is classic? What is democracy? What are these new values? We'll begin our discussion of early classical art by looking at the ancient Aegean world and 3 cultures. Okay, we're going to be looking at 3 very specific cultures today: the Cycladic, the Minoan, and the Mycenaean. And one of the things that I always like to talk about is how geography affects the kind of art that you make. Okay, so what am I talking about? And we're going to look at this again. I'm going to put myself up here. If you live on an island with water around you, right? You're not going to need the same kind of protective wall and defensive, thick, fortress kind of structure as you would if you live on the mainland at Mycenae or at Tiryns, okay? If you are a seafaring culture and you live on all these small islands, the subject of your art is probably going to be marine life and boating and fish, right? So where you live, the geography of where you are and where you end up is going to affect very significantly what your art looks like. So we're going to start with the Cycladic culture. And Cycladic art is extremely mysterious because we don't have any written records of what it is and what it was used for. And so I wanted to just let you know that the principal source of information in the Cycladic world is really only their art. Pottery and clay figures were found in hillside burial chambers. And the Cycladic people were very well known for these sculptures, okay? You see them, they're these human figurines of local fine white marble. Most of the figurines were of women, okay? And you can see that there is a very sort of flattened, simple aspect to them. And what's interesting, I believe this is a drawing that I pulled from your book, where they really are analyzed by a very specific geometric system, 3 circles that intersect. And it's interesting to compare, right, the Cycladic female figure to really the first piece of art we talked about this semester, the Venus of Willendorf. But the sculpture is really reduced completely to its pure geometric essentials. And that's why a lot of people, when they look at Cycladic art, and on the left you'll see an image of it in the museum, a lot of people really feel that it looks extremely modern. And in fact, there were many instances where there were fakes, forgeries of these sculptures made, introduced to the market, and it was a problem. This is a really beautiful sculpture that I just wanted to show you. It's very rare to see kind of a group like this. Oops. Make it a little smaller. Yeah. And I love this one, right? It's this family holding up a child, and you can see kind of why perhaps these things do look incredibly modern, right? But again, it's sculpture in the round, pure sculpture in the round, reduced to geometric essentials. And yet they do retain the elements that make us understand exactly what they are and their body shapes, right? And that's really what I wanted you to know about Cycladic art. Here's one that was just a head, or just this head was found. So you can see the beautiful detail of it. Now we're going to talk about the Minoan. So the Cycladic art we looked at is from this area, the Cyclades, these islands. And now we're going to be talking about this area, the Minoan culture, and very, very specifically, by the way, today it's the island of Crete, and we're going to be looking at a palace structure that is at Knossos. So we've now moved from these islands here to the island of Crete, a bigger island, and this is called Minoan art. And the Minoans are a civilization that is kind of contemporary with the middle kingdom of Egypt and ancient Mesopotamia. So that gives you a really kind of interesting perspective of the time frame. And this is a drawing of the reconstruction of the palace that we think or we believe stood at Knossos, and it's a really interesting thing. It's around the time of Hammurabi, and the people here, the kings, certainly they were a great seafaring power. And in Crete, there's really not much emphasis at all on temples or tombs, which is something we had been used to. But the most permanent architecture, in fact, were palace complexes. And you can see this. Not only is it, a palace, but look over here. It's like 4 stories high. It's really, really incredible. It was a 3-acre palace, on a 6-acre site. And we believe that there were over 1,000 interlocking rooms. And here you can see sort of a plan of the palace at Knossos. This is what it looked like in sort of the archaeological phase where it was being uncovered. And it's really quite fascinating to think about the systems that were put in here. There was literally plumbing. Water could be brought and taken away from certain chambers. Water could be heated. There was an earthquake-proof flexible wall system. There was a drainage system, ventilation. It was quite a sophisticated complex, really quite well done. And it was believed to be built by a famous Athenian architect named Daedalus. So that's kind of just the ancient theories. We don't have any proof of that at all. So here you can see kind of the red columns that are very unusual because they kind of are reversed. What am I talking about? Well, when I say reversed, the bottom part is smaller than the top part, right? Which is kind of unusual. You would expect it to be the other way to support the load. But this is in fact how the building worked, and it's a very typical Cretan sort of style of column. You can always recognize it. Here's people kind of hanging out at the archaeological site, and you can see the multi-stories of the building, which is really something unbelievable for this stage. And I wanted to show you this. This is the way the roof is constructed, shows that the architect understood a way to build a system that in fact would be earthquake proof, it's called. On the walls, we have beautiful paintings, and you can see some of them here, and they are called frescoes. And fresco, if you think about the word fresco, sounds like the word fresh, right? Fresh. So what is a fresco? And this is the first time we're encountering a fresco. A fresco is a painting that is painted onto a surface of wet plaster. So instead of it being painted onto a wall and sitting on the wall, because the plaster on the wall is wet, when you paint it, the pigment goes into the wall and becomes the wall. It becomes one. And of course, the most famous frescoes that we will look at this semester are the frescoes that Michelangelo painted on the ceiling at the Sistine Chapel during the High Renaissance. This is really the first time that we see fresco painting, and I wanted to just talk about a few of them. So here's one. She's been given this nickname, La Parisienne, the Parisian woman. And almost all of the frescoes that you see here are of young, ageless adults. The sexes are typically color-coded. Men typically have dark skin. Women typically have white skin. And you see her here, right? She's given this nickname La Parisienne because of her fancy hairdo and her black eyeliner and her red lips. She is in profile, and her eye is facing forward, which is very similar to what we saw in Egypt, but it's much looser, right? It's a much more loosely curvilinear, relaxed style than anything that we would have seen in Egyptian conventions. Remember, there was a canon of proportion and a very specific system that the Egyptians used to make their art. And so this is quite different than what we've seen there. So have a look at this. This is so awesome and such a beautiful fresco, right? It's the bull leaping, and it is from the wall of the palace at Knossos. And I want to talk about it a little bit. It's probably one of the most famous frescoes. It's 2'8" high, right? So that's, 32 inches high. And we know that there were numerous scenes depicting bulls, and the archaeologist Arthur Evans concluded that the Minoans worshipped the bull. So it's an interesting thing to think about because we've seen the bull, right? We saw a lot of bulls, certainly in the cave paintings, and we saw a lot of bulls in ancient Near Eastern art as well. It's really believed that it is in fact an athletic feat or some sort of a game. It's unclear if it was sort of a religious ritual. It's doubtful that it was some sort of a sacrificial activity, but it's really believed to be some sort of an athletic event. And so you can see this guy over here kind of holding the bull's horns, and then somebody in the midst of a gymnastic move flipping over, and then this guy over here waiting to catch the person, right? Potentially because of the color of the skin, maybe these are two women and this is a man. As I mentioned before, typically that's how the sexes were color coded. Some people believe that it's actually a time lapse of the same person, right? So that you've got the kind of, here he is getting ready. Step 2, he's flipping over, and step 3, he's landing the way the gymnasts land. So that's another possible Cirque du Soleil interpretation. But what I want to talk about is kind of the more artistic way it's represented, this very beautiful geometric border, and kind of the energy that you see here of the line, right? This beautiful lines that makes your eye move all the way forward and all the way across the really energetic and kind of lighthearted feeling of this. And these guys, the Cretans, right, the Minoans, were kind of considered to be the flower children of the ancient world. And you can see that in the energy and the beauty of this, and also of La Parisienne. What's interesting is there was this little sculpture found made out of ivory, and it's believed to be connected to this, to what's going on, that it's a bull leaper, right? So maybe this was kind of their trademark sport that they were known for. And I love kind of the light, beautiful energy. And look at the detail here, guys. Look at the arm and the muscles, right? Look at the way the head is tilted back. So that's a really beautiful thing. The last thing I want to talk about is, in fact, pottery. And this jug that has been nicknamed the octopus jar, and obviously you can see why. So the Minoans are really wonderful in the fact that they introduce the potter's wheel. And they having a wheel to make pottery versus a hand-built pottery. If any of you have ever taken a pottery class or seen any ceramics, you know that using a fast potter's wheel allows thinner walls and more sophisticated shapes to be created. And in fact, there is evidence of very large pottery studios among these communities. And we see light painting on a dark background, and in this case, dark painting on a light background. So, we look at a pot like this and we look at it as a piece of art, but, pots have function. And so if somebody came in, 500 years and did an archaeological dig at my house, they might find my pot, right? This is my pot with my decoration on it. Actually, I don't know what happened to this mug, but you get the point. So even though this is today seen as a piece of art, it was, it had a very specific function. And I want to just talk about it in terms of this kind of move towards naturalism. You see that it is dark paint on a light background. And you can see that the artist probably began in the middle, created this face of this octopus, and then covered every part of the pot, right? Did not want to leave any empty space. Look at all the way the artist has drawn each tentacle. And then in the empty spaces in between, there are these beautiful shapes. I believe they're probably some sort of a seaweed or plant life that is placed inside, so that every spot, every area is covered in something beautiful and something artistic to look at. And that's what we call horror vacui, which means fear of empty space. Okay? So we've now looked at two of the three cultures that I said we were going to speak about today, the Cycladic culture, and we just looked at the Minoans and specifically the palace at Knossos. And you can see how being surrounded by water, of course, your art is very much about that. But now we're going to go to the last culture we're looking at today, the Mycenaean culture, and that is very much the people of the mainland. And they are a warring culture dating to around the 3rd millennium, which is where we are. And this is the world of Homer, right? The ancient Greek poet who is believed to be the author of the Iliad and the Odyssey, who is a legendary figure. And we know mostly about him from oral tradition. And if you're interested in more of this time period, you can always watch this movie. I think it's called Troy, that Brad Pitt is in. But what I want you guys to think about is, what's really interesting is, look at the columns here in the recreation of this palace, right? See the columns? So the stage set designers for the movie absolutely looked at the palace of Knossos, and this is where they got their inspiration of potentially what the columns in Troy could have looked like. Similarly, in designing the costume for our friend, Mr. Pitt, Brad Pitt, they obviously looked at pottery, right? They looked at this vase, which is called the warrior vase from Mycenena, and it's a very different look than what we had seen before in the culture, in the Minoan culture, right? It is strikingly different costumes and figure types than the Minoans. The profile is different. It's all about war, and this is the kind of artistic intent of this particular culture. So I want to talk about the differences between what we learned about in Knossos and certainly at Tiryns, a citadel. And the main thing I want you guys to see is that here in Tiryns, there's this massive, see this thick black line? This is the big fortress wall that would have surrounded the entire complex. And we don't have it here. I mean, you could literally come along here and just walk right into the temple or into the palace. So we know that they needed this protection because they are on the mainland. And here you can see it, right? You can see this big, thick line, this big, thick wall that would have surrounded the building to protect it. In fact, this big, thick wall was not solid, but you could walk inside of it. And we learn a new word now called corbelling. Okay, corbelling means that the stones are projecting out a little bit past the one under it to create this shape. And I'm going to go over that again in a couple of minutes. The stones were so big and so large that it got this nickname Cyclopean masonry. And for those of you who never heard of Cyclops, he was a legendary giant, a giant with one eye from ancient Greek culture and ancient Greek mythology. So let's look at this because this is really kind of important. And I want to just talk about 3 different ways to create an opening, because this is kind of important to where we're going this semester. So the first system is called post and lintel, right? Post and lintel systems are very simple, and we saw them, say, in a place called Stonehenge. We saw them also in all the temples in Egypt. So you put 2 things, 2 vertical elements and something across the top, and you create an opening. If you put 100 of these all in a row, you create a space with a flat roof. Corbelling, as I mentioned, is you have a vertical element like a post, but then you start to project stones a little bit further until you reach the top. And what happens now, instead of having a flat top, you have this kind of triangular shape. Corbelling is important because it's eventually going to lead us to the arch. And we're going to be learning all about the arch when we talk about Rome, okay? But you can see here this example of corbelled masonry. And you can see that we don't have a flat roof here, right? A flat ceiling. We have this incredible space. All of this is exemplified in this structure called the Lion's Gate at Mycenena. And I'm going to show you guys a video right now that is going to take us through all of these different things I've been talking about in a beautiful way. So here's the Lion's Gate. We have post and lintel system, right? And then above it, we have corbelling, right? A little bit further, a little bit further, a little bit further, and it creates this triangular, beautiful triangular space where there's a very famous sculpture called the Lions, or the Lion's Gate. All right, so let me turn this on for you now.
The approach to Mycenae is substantial, and if you were not a friend, it was going to be tough to get in. Mycenae is one of the great citadels of Mycenaean culture. That is, this Bronze Age culture on mainland Greece that traded throughout the Mediterranean and became quite wealthy and quite powerful between the years of about 1600 and 1100 BCE.
Right, and there were several cultures that thrived in this area during this Bronze Age period, one being Cycladic, located on the Cycladic Islands, another being Minoan culture, which was on the island of Crete. So here on the mainland, we refer to Mycenaean culture, named after the most powerful of the Mycenaean city-states, and that was Mycenae.
Now, Mycenae is located on the top of a small mountain. It is a very steep approach, and so it is naturally defensible. In fact, there are 2 larger mountains on the back, a huge valley leading down to the Aegean Sea in front, just a glorious space, but also one where enemies' approach can be seen at a very great distance.
Walking up this rampway, we're surrounded by enormous blocks of stone, creating very high walls on either side of us.
In fact, they're so large that they were known as Cyclopean masonry. That is, only the giant Cyclops was large enough to move stones this big.
Right. The Cyclops was a legendary giant from Homer's Odyssey. And so these became known as Cyclopean because who could imagine moving these massive stones?
I have to tell you, I can't imagine. So, as you said, we're surrounded by these walls on 3 sides, which means that we are completely unprotected. If we were an enemy approaching, it would be easy to rain arrows, spears, anything down on us.
Exactly. I would have felt very safe, I think, in the Mycenaean citadel. So we're looking up at the famous so-called Lion Gate.
It is perched above a standard ancient building system of post and lintel. On both sides, we have uprights, posts, and spanning it across a horizontal lintel.
The Mycenaean architects wanted to build this wall very high, and they used a technique called corbelling. That is, they constructed the stones so that each successive higher layer moved in just slightly, and that left this triangular space in the center, right over the lintel,
The relief above the Lion Gate is the first monumental sculpture that we found on mainland Greece. And since we know what happens in ancient Greece, in historical Greece, much later, we look back to this as art historians and say, here is the earliest representation that we find from Greece. This is, in a sense, the great-grandfather of the extraordinary work that the Greeks will produce.
In sculpture, absolutely.
Right, in sculpture and in architecture.
So here we have two animals facing one another. Their forepaws seem to be on two altar-like tables, and between them is a column that seems to get wider as it moves upward.
Now that's opposite to the way we understand Greek architecture at a later period, but it is very similar to the way that the Minoans constructed their architecture. And so archaeologists often look at that and say this is a Minoan-style column.
And we know that the Minoans really influenced Mycenaean culture, so this makes sense. And that capital also is reminiscent of Minoan culture.
Now, just below the capital, archaeologists have hypothesized that the two blocks that the animals have their forepaws on and that the column rests on are two altars. These are also of Minoan form, we think. And, of course, we have no written records. We really have no solid evidence for any kind of interpretation, but that hasn't stopped archaeologists and art historians from making a lot of very clever guesses about what this might represent.
Well, we do have objects from Mycenae. We have objects that were found in the graves. It does help us to conjecture what these animals were and what their lost heads looked like.
We can guess that the lost heads turned outward because of the way the dowel holes are placed in the stone.
And that they were likely of a different material placed onto the bodies of these animals.
And at least one scholar has suggested that they might have been bird heads and that these might have been griffins, and that the composite nature of the animal might also be reflected by the composite nature of the materials. But again, these are guesses.
What do the animals mean? What does the column mean? What do the altars mean? Why are they up on their forepaws? You can see all the questions that arise.
There is a tradition of having powerful animals standing guard at a gate, and so we might think of these that might scare off and terrify enemies.
And so if they had that kind of supernatural power, we might also conjecture that the column has meaning as well. And we know that in some cases, columns could represent deities. Now, it also could be that the columns just represent a city or the idea of the king.
Well, the column is above the altar, so there is that sense of divinity that seems logical. And the fact that there are two altars has led some scholars to suggest that perhaps this has to do with the coming together of two cultures. But again, these are all conjectures.
These animals do have leonine bodies, or bodies like lions.
Or lionesses.
And they are sculpted with great subtlety. I get a sense of the muscles in the legs of the lions and a kind of subtle modeling of the anatomy of these animals.
There's something else that's going on here. These are not animals that are represented as animals are naturally. That is, they're not on all four paws. They are standing upright. They are becoming human-like. There is a kind of nobility.
It's hard not to think that these also speak to the power of the king who resided inside these cyclopean walls.
Here now, at the end of 2013, the sense of power and majesty is clear to me. One can only imagine how this felt to somebody in 1250 BCE.
So I hope you enjoyed that video, the Khan Academy video that really takes you through a lot of the points that I want you guys to know for the Lion's Gate and the many qualities and characteristics that we've been talking about. So to sum up kind of some of the issues we talked about today and where we're going to be going next class when we talk about ancient Greek art and the classical age, I want you again to ask yourselves this question, right? What does the word classic mean to you when you talk about it in terms of art? And there are actually three different or several different interpretations of what it means. Sort of the classic, the first rank, the highest rank. And also later on it became, the word classic began to represent something belonging to ancient Greek and Roman time or antiquity. And so when we say something is neoclassical or classical, it is in fact referring to ancient Greece and Rome. So you have this classic figure that we'll talk about next class from 330 BCE. You have that famous sculpture of the David by Michelangelo. And of course, we have a sculpture done in 1840 in what we call the neoclassical style of what was supposed to be George Washington looking like Zeus, which is not how we like to represent our leaders. All sort of very, very different time periods that you see here, but from this kind of classic style. We are going to talk about the evolution from the simplicity of the human figure. This is a Greek figure that looks very much like an Egyptian figure, to how the Greeks are going to introduce movement and motion into their figures by the Kritios boy. And I also wanted to let you guys know that we have a beautiful sculpture here at the MFA called Juno, and here's one of my students at the museum visiting it with her selfie, talking about how fortunate we are to have this sculpture. So I'm going to be talking about all of these next class, but what I really want you guys to understand is that in a very short period of time, we're going to go from this style of representing the human figure, typically Egyptian, right, standing straight, shoulder straight, hips straight, one foot in front of the other, to the Greeks who miraculously in stone learn how to show the body in motion, right? So we're going to go from this to this to this, and ultimately to these incredible sculptures. So I hope you enjoyed this lecture. I will be posting it, and I look forward to your thoughts, your questions, and continuing our discussion about the ancient world. Thanks.